June 12, 1944. Northern France, 3 kilometers behind enemy lines. The night air hung thick with moisture as Staff Sergeant Tommy Whitehorse of the 1st Special Service Force pressed his body against the wet earth, watching the German communications post through the darkness. The structure sat nestled in a small valley, its radio antenna reaching toward the clouded sky like an accusing finger. Around him, 299 American and Canadian soldiers waited in the forest, their advance stalled, their mission teetering on the edge of catastrophic failure. What none of them could have imagined was that the solution to their impossible problem lay not in their Thompson submachine guns, their grenades, or their modern military training, but in a skill passed down through generations of Whitehorse's ancestors in the mesas of New Mexico. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. In the next 6 hours, this 28-year-old Apache soldier would prove that sometimes the oldest methods succeed where the newest fail, and in doing so, he would save 300 lives with nothing more than a wooden bow, 3 arrows, and the wisdom his grandfather had taught him as a boy. Tommy Whitehorse had grown up in the shadow of the Sandia Mountains, where his grandfather, a respected elder of the Mescalero Apache, had taught him the old ways. While other boys his age attended government schools and learned to forget their heritage, Tommy spent his summers learning to track deer through pine forests, to move without sound across rocky ground, and to fashion a bow from juniper wood that could send an arrow through a target at 60 paces. His grandfather had told him that these skills were more than tradition. They were survival, encoded in the blood and bone of their people across countless generations. When the United States entered the global conflict in 1941, Tommy had been working as a ranch hand outside Albuquerque. He enlisted in early 1942, joining thousands of other Native American men who answered the call despite the discrimination and hardship their communities faced at home. The military had initially been skeptical of Native recruits, but they quickly discovered that men like Tommy brought unique skills to modern operations. His ability to navigate terrain, to remain motionless for hours, and to move silently through any environment soon caught the attention of his commanding officers. By 1944, Tommy had been selected for the 1st Special Service Force, an elite unit of American and Canadian soldiers trained for reconnaissance and sabotage operations. The force specialized in unconventional tactics, often operating behind enemy lines for days or weeks at a time. They were known as the Devil's Brigade by the German forces who encountered them, a name earned through their effectiveness and their willingness to engage in operations that conventional units considered too dangerous. The mission that brought Tommy to that wet French hillside had begun 3 days earlier. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded, but the advance inland had created numerous pockets where German forces maintained strong defensive positions. One such position was a heavily fortified communications relay station that coordinated artillery positions across a 12-kilometer front. Allied intelligence had identified the station as a critical target. If it could be neutralized, an entire division could advance with minimal resistance. If it remained operational, any advance would be met with precisely coordinated artillery that would result in catastrophic casualties. The 1st Special Service Force had been tasked with infiltrating enemy territory, locating the communications post and destroying it. The operation required absolute stealth. The German defenders in this sector were veterans of the Eastern campaigns, experienced and alert. Any indication of the Allied presence would trigger an immediate response that would compromise not just the immediate mission, but the larger offensive planned for the following week. Major Richard Carlson, the unit commander, was a career officer from Vermont who had graduated from West Point in 1936. He had led the force through operations in Italy and southern France, earning a reputation for careful planning and concern for his men's safety. As he briefed his team before the insertion, his voice carried the weight of the responsibility he felt. "Gentlemen," Carlson said, spreading aerial reconnaissance photographs across the makeshift table in their forward camp, "this is our objective. German communications relay, estimated garrison of 25 to 30 soldiers, connected to regional command by both radio and telephone line. The building is a converted farmhouse, stone construction, 2 stories, Guards rotate every 4 hours. Perimeter sentries walk a standard patrol pattern. Lieutenant James Morrison, a Canadian officer from Ontario who served as Carlson's executive officer, studied the photographs with a practiced eye. Morrison had been a competitive marksman before the conflict and possessed an almost scientific understanding of sightlines and firing positions. "Sir," Morrison observed, "the approaches are completely exposed. 300 meters of open ground on all sides. They've cleared the field specifically to prevent infiltration. Even at night, any movement will be visible to the sentries." "Correct," Carlson acknowledged. "Which is why we'll approach from the north, using the creek bed that runs within 200 meters of the structure. We'll move during their guard change at 0200 hours, when their attention is focused inward. Once in position, we'll use suppressed weapons to eliminate the exterior sentries, then breach and clear the building." Tommy had listened to the briefing without comment, but something about the plan troubled him. He had learned to trust his instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive through a dozen operations. The creek bed approach was sound, but the moment they opened engagement, even with suppressed weapons, the operation would become loud and chaotic. The German defenders would have time to transmit warnings, to alert nearby units, to compromise the entire offensive. The insertion had gone smoothly. All 300 soldiers of the force had crossed enemy lines under cover of darkness, moving through the French countryside with the silence and coordination that made them legendary. They had avoided German patrols, bypassed defensive positions, and reached their staging area without incident. Then they had settled in to observe the target, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. That was when the problem revealed itself. The aerial reconnaissance had been accurate about the building's structure and the visible defenses. What it had not shown was the interior guard rotation. Through careful observation over 24 hours, Tommy and his fellow scouts determined that the communications post maintained a constant interior guard of at least 8 soldiers, working in shifts to ensure the radio equipment was always monitored. More critically, the radio operator on duty maintained an open communication link with regional command, checking in every 30 minutes with status updates. Major Carlson gathered his officers in a small depression, a kilometer from the target, to discuss the new intelligence. "The situation has changed," Carlson said, his jaw tight with frustration. "We cannot use our original plan. The moment we engage, the radio operator will transmit a warning. Even if we breach within seconds, they'll have time to alert command. Our entire offensive will be compromised." "What about cutting their communications?" suggested Captain Robert Walsh, an American officer from Chicago who commanded one of the assault teams. "If we can sever the telephone lines and jam their radio before we attack," Morrison shook his head. "The telephone lines are underground, inside German-held territory. We'd need engineering equipment to locate and cut them, and our radio jamming equipment is back with the main force. Even if we sent runners to retrieve it, the operation would be delayed by at least 48 hours. Command wants this done tonight." The officers fell silent, each considering and discarding potential solutions. They were trained for decisive action, but this situation demanded something beyond their standard tactics. Tommy had remained at the edge of the group, listening but not participating. Officers made decisions, sergeants executed them. That was the military hierarchy, and Tommy had learned to work within it. But as the discussion continued, with each proposed solution revealing new complications, Tommy found himself remembering something his grandfather had told him during a hunting trip when he was 14 years old. "The deer knows every sound of the forest," his grandfather had said, demonstrating how to move through brush without creating noise. "If you use a gun, the deer hears the shot before the bullet arrives and moves, but an arrow moves in silence. The deer falls before it knows death approaches. Sometimes the old ways work because they understand something the new ways have forgotten. Silence is more powerful than noise." Tommy spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. "Sir, I might have a solution." The officers turned to look at him. In the military hierarchy of 1944, a sergeant interrupting an officer's planning session was unusual, but the 1st Special Service Force operated with less rigid formality than conventional units. Major Carlson had learned to listen to his experienced sergeants, especially those with proven judgment. "Go ahead, Whitehorse," Carlson said. The radio antenna, Tommy said. It's mounted on the roof, connected to the equipment inside by a cable that runs down the exterior wall. If we could sever that cable, their radio would be useless. They'd have no way to transmit a warning. We've considered that, Walsh replied, but the cable is visible from all sentry positions. Any approach would be detected, and even with suppressed weapons, the sound of shots would alert the interior guard. I wasn't thinking of using guns, sir, Tommy said. He explained his idea. The officers listened with expressions that progressed from skepticism to fascination to something approaching hope. When Tommy finished, Major Carlson was silent for a long moment, weighing the proposal against their limited alternatives. "You're confident you can make this shot?" Carlson asked. "In the dark, at that distance, hitting a cable probably no more than 2 centimeters in diameter." "My grandfather made me practice until I could hit a rabbit at 80 paces, Tommy replied. "The cable won't move like a rabbit does. I can make the shot." "And you can do this silently?" Morrison added. "No sound that would alert the sentries?" "An arrow makes no sound, sir. Just the whisper of feathers through air. I've used a bow since I was 8 years old. This is what my people did for centuries before guns existed. We survived because we could strike without warning." Carlson made his decision. "All right, Sergeant. We'll try it your way. But you'll need a bow and arrows, unless you happen to bring them from New Mexico." "No, sir," Tommy said, "but I can make them. I'll need about 6 hours." The idea of a modern soldier fashioning a primitive weapon in the middle of an enemy-controlled territory seemed absurd on its surface, but Carlson had learned to trust his men's expertise. "You have 4 hours," he said. "We attack at 0200 regardless. If your bow isn't ready, we proceed with the original plan and accept the consequences." Tommy set to work immediately. The forests of northern France were different from the landscapes of New Mexico, but wood was wood, and Tommy had learned to adapt traditional methods to whatever materials were available. He searched the forest floor until he found a young ash sapling, approximately as thick as his forearm, with straight grain and green wood that would provide the necessary flexibility. Using his combat knife, he carefully cut and shaped the wood, creating the distinctive curve of a traditional bow. Private Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco who served as one of the unit's scouts, watched the process with fascination. Chen had grown up in his grandfather's import business and had developed an appreciation for traditional craftsmanship. He sat beside Tommy as the sergeant worked, keeping watch while asking occasional questions. "My grandfather did traditional calligraphy," Chen said quietly. "He told me that modern tools make things faster, but traditional tools make things right. I never understood what he meant until now. You really think this will work?" "It has to," Tommy replied, carefully testing the bow's flexibility. "The old ways work because they were perfected through necessity. My ancestors didn't use bows because they preferred them to guns. They used bows because they were silent, reliable, and effective. Those advantages don't disappear just because time passes." For the bowstring, Tommy used paracord from his equipment, twisting multiple strands together to create the necessary strength. It wasn't traditional sinew or plant fiber, but it would serve. The critical element was tension, and Tommy adjusted the string length until the bow had the proper draw weight. Too weak and the arrow wouldn't have sufficient force. Too strong, and accuracy would suffer. The arrows were more challenging. Tommy needed straight shafts with the right weight and flexibility. He found several oak branches that met his requirements, cut them to length, and carefully stripped away bark and imperfections. For the arrowheads, he used metal tent stakes, grinding them against stone until they had sharp points and securing them with more paracord. The fletching came from duct tape, cut and shaped to provide the necessary stability in flight. By the time he finished, the bow and 3 arrows looked primitive compared to the advanced weapons carried by the rest of the unit. But when Tommy tested the first arrow against a tree trunk 60 meters away, it struck precisely where he aimed, driving deep into the wood with enough force to be lethal at twice that distance. Captain Walsh had observed the final test shot. He approached Tommy with an expression of grudging respect. "I'm from Chicago, Sergeant. The closest I ever came to traditional skills was watching my father fix a car engine. What you just did seems like magic to me. But I've been in this military long enough to know that every culture develops the skills it needs to survive. I'm glad you learned yours. My grandfather always said that tradition isn't about living in the past, Tommy replied, recovering his arrow. It's about carrying forward the wisdom that worked. When everything else fails, the old ways remember what the new ways forgot. At 2300 hours, Major Carlson assembled the force for final briefing. The 300 soldiers gathered in small groups, their faces darkened with camouflage paint, their equipment checked and rechecked. Carlson's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Tommy would approach the target from the north, using the creek bed to get within range of the antenna cable. Once he severed the cable, silencing the radio, the rest of the force would assault the position from 3 directions simultaneously. Without the ability to call for support, the German defenders would be isolated and overwhelmed. "Gentlemen," Carlson said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air, "we've trained for situations exactly like this. The enemy holds a strategic position, but they depend on technology to maintain their advantage. Tonight we're going to prove that technology can be defeated by skill and courage. Sergeant Whitehorse will eliminate their communications capability. When that's accomplished, we move." Questions? There were none. These were experienced soldiers who understood their roles. Lieutenant Morrison added a final note. "For those of you who haven't seen Sergeant Whitehorse's bow, I'll tell you this, I've watched him practice. He can hit a target smaller than my fist at distances that would challenge most riflemen. Trust in his skill, trust in your training, and we'll all be having breakfast in friendly territory by dawn." Tommy moved out first, crawling through the wet grass with his bow strapped across his back and his 3 arrows secured carefully in his belt. The journey to the creek bed took 40 minutes, every meter covered with painstaking care. The German sentries were visible in the distance, their silhouettes occasionally passing in front of lighted windows. Tommy focused on his breathing, on moving with the rhythm of the wind through the grass, on becoming part of the landscape rather than a foreign element within it. The creek bed provided good cover, but poor footing. The recent rain had swollen the stream, and cold water soaked through Tommy's uniform as he crawled along the muddy bank. He kept the bow above water, protecting it from moisture that might weaken the string or warp the wood. His grandfather had taught him that a bow was a living tool, responsive to temperature and humidity, requiring respect and care. When he reached his planned position, Tommy slowly raised his head above the creek bank to assess the situation. The communications post stood approximately 90 meters away, clearly visible in the ambient light from its windows. The radio antenna rose from the roof, exactly as the reconnaissance photographs had shown. The cable running down the exterior wall was less visible, but Tommy's eyes were trained to pick out details in low light. He located it after several seconds of careful observation. A thin line, darker than the stone wall behind it, running from the antenna mounting point down to a junction box at ground level. The shot was feasible but challenging. 90 meters was within his effective range, but the cable presented a target only slightly wider than his thumb. Wind would be a factor, trajectory would require careful calculation, and he would have exactly one opportunity. If he missed, the sound of the arrow striking stone would likely alert the sentries. If he succeeded, the cable would be severed silently, and the German radio would become a useless box of electronics. Tommy withdrew slightly below the creek bank and prepared his shot. He removed the bow from his back and checked the string tension. Still good, despite the moisture. He selected his first arrow and examined it carefully. The improvised arrowhead was straight and sharp. The fletching was secure. The shaft showed no cracks or warps. This arrow would fly true. He returned to his observation position and studied the target again, this time analyzing the shot itself. The cable ran vertically down the wall, providing a narrow target, but one that extended for several meters. Tommy didn't need to hit a specific point. Any location along the cable's length would suffice. He noted the gentle breeze coming from the west, barely perceptible but enough to affect an arrow's flight at this distance. He would need to aim slightly into the wind to compensate. Tommy knocked the arrow, feeling the familiar weight of the bow in his left hand and the tension of the string in his right. This was a motion he had performed thousands of times, first as a boy learning from his grandfather, then as a young man hunting in the mountains, and now as a soldier executing a mission that would determine whether 300 men lived or died. The mechanics were identical regardless of context. Draw the string back to the corner of his mouth. Align the arrow with the target. Feel the bow's tension reaching its peak. Find that moment of perfect stillness where breath, heartbeat, and motion all synchronized. He released. The arrow flew through the darkness with that distinctive whisper his grandfather had taught him to recognize. For 2 seconds that seemed to extend into eternity. Tommy tracked its flight, watching it arc across the space between him and the communications post. Then it struck. The cable parted with a sound like a quiet snap, barely audible even to Tommy. The severed ends fell away from each other, one hanging loose from the roof, the other dangling from the junction box. Inside the building, the radio operator would be seeing his equipment suddenly go dead, the carrier signal that connected him to regional command vanishing without warning. He would likely assume a technical malfunction, would begin troubleshooting procedures, would waste precious minutes trying to restore communications before accepting that something more serious had occurred. Those minutes were all the first Special Service Force needed. Tommy remained motionless in the creek bed, watching as the German sentries continued their patrols, completely unaware that their communications had just been severed. Behind him, he knew, 300 soldiers were beginning their approach, moving through the darkness with practiced coordination. They would reach the building's perimeter in approximately 10 minutes, would breach simultaneously from 3 directions, and would overwhelm the defenders before any organized resistance could develop. The operation unfolded exactly as Major Carlson had planned. The assault teams moved into position, using the same techniques of stealth and patience that had brought them this far behind enemy lines. When Carlson gave the signal, they attacked with overwhelming speed and precision. The German defenders, already confused by their communications failure, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to materialize from the darkness itself. The entire engagement lasted less than 8 minutes. The German soldiers, veteran troops though they were, recognized the hopelessness of their situation and surrendered rather than fight to the last man. Not a single member of the 1st Special Service Force was seriously injured. The communications post was captured intact, and the Allied forces gained access to intelligence documents that revealed the locations of multiple artillery positions across the region. Major Carlson entered the communications room and found the radio operator still frantically trying to restore his equipment. The German soldier looked up as American soldiers secured the room, his expression showing complete bewilderment. Through an interpreter, he explained that the radio had simply stopped functioning without any warning. No explosion, no visible damage, just sudden silence. Carlson stepped outside and looked up at the severed cable, then smiled. He found Tommy helping to secure prisoners, the bow already disassembled and returned to his pack. "Sergeant Whitehorse," Carlson said, "I've been in this military for 12 years. I've seen brave men, skilled men, innovative men, but I've never seen anyone solve a problem quite like you solved this one tonight. That shot you made was impossible by any reasonable standard, yet you made it anyway." "My grandfather would say it wasn't impossible, sir," Tommy replied. "Just improbable. And improbable becomes probable with enough practice and proper respect for the tools you use." The successful operation allowed the Allied offensive to proceed on schedule. The artillery positions identified through captured documents were neutralized by air operations, and an entire division advanced through the sector with minimal casualties. The 299 soldiers who would have been exposed to coordinated artillery fire during a conventional assault survived to continue fighting. Many of them would later tell stories about the Apache sergeant who saved their lives with a bow and arrow, though some listeners would assume the stories were exaggerated. Lieutenant Morrison filed a detailed after-action report that specifically noted Tommy's contribution. The report worked its way up through military channels, eventually reaching officers who found the account so unusual they requested verification from multiple sources. When Carlson confirmed every detail, Tommy was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action, one of relatively few such decorations given to Native American soldiers, despite their disproportionate service and sacrifice during the conflict. But for Tommy, the real significance of that night went beyond military recognition. He had proven, at least to himself, that the old ways his grandfather had taught him were not mere tradition or historical curiosity. They were practical skills that remained relevant even in an age of advanced technology. The bow his ancestors had used to hunt buffalo and defend their territory had found new purpose in a different kind of conflict, and the wisdom passed down through generations had contributed to a modern military victory. After the campaign in France concluded, Tommy returned to New Mexico. He resumed his work as a ranch hand, but also began teaching young people from his community the traditional skills his grandfather had taught him. He explained to them that tradition wasn't about rejecting progress or living in the past. It was about maintaining connection to knowledge that had proven its worth across centuries, about remembering that sometimes the simplest solution to a complex problem came from understanding what worked before anyone thought to improve it. Robert Chen, the soldier who had watched Tommy craft his bow, kept in contact with him after the conflict ended. Chen had gone on to become a successful architect in San Francisco, but he never forgot the lesson he learned that night in France. In his design work, he often found himself asking whether modern solutions were truly better than traditional approaches, or whether they were simply different. Some of his most acclaimed buildings incorporated traditional Chinese architectural principles that his grandfather's generation had brought from the old country, adapted to modern materials and purposes, but still rooted in ancient wisdom. Major Carlson retired from military service in 1952 and wrote a memoir about his experiences commanding the 1st Special Service Force. An entire chapter focused on the night Tommy Whitehorse severed a radio cable with an arrow, describing it as the most innovative tactical solution he encountered during his entire career. When asked why he devoted so much attention to what some reviewers called a minor incident, Carlson replied that the incident exemplified something essential about military effectiveness. Technology could be defeated, conventional approaches could fail, but individual skill, creativity, and cultural knowledge could often succeed where standard methods faltered. The story of Tommy's bow eventually became part of the official history of the 1st Special Service Force, though it remained relatively obscure outside military circles. Historians who studied unconventional warfare occasionally mentioned it as an example of adaptive tactics, but most analyses focused on the force's more conventional operations. The idea that a Native American soldier had used traditional hunting techniques to enable a modern military operation seemed almost too unusual to fit into standard historical narratives. Yet for the 300 soldiers who participated in that night's mission, the story was neither unusual nor peripheral. They understood that they had witnessed something remarkable, a moment when the accumulated wisdom of centuries had proven itself against the most advanced military technology of its era. Many of them told the story to their children and grandchildren, usually adding that they had learned an important lesson that night about respecting different forms of knowledge and recognizing that innovation sometimes meant remembering rather than inventing. Tommy Whitehorse passed away in 1986 at the age of 70. His funeral was attended by more than 200 people, including several dozen veterans who had served with him in the 1st Special Service Force. Several of them spoke about the night in France, describing how Tommy's skill and courage had saved their lives. His grandson, who had learned to use a bow under Tommy's instruction, noted in his eulogy that his grandfather had never considered himself a hero. He had simply done what needed to be done, using the skills his own grandfather had taught him, demonstrating that tradition and progress were not opposites, but partners in solving the challenges each generation faced. The communications post Tommy had helped capture was demolished during later fighting and never reconstructed. The farm that had preceded it returned to agricultural use after the conflict ended, and eventually the land was sold to developers who built a small residential community on the site. None of the current residents know that their homes stand where a young Apache soldier once made an impossible shot that changed the course of a military operation and saved 300 lives. But the lesson Tommy demonstrated that night remains relevant. In an age of increasingly complex technology and sophisticated solutions, there is still value in simple, proven methods. The bow and arrow succeeded where modern weapons would have failed, not because traditional tools are superior to modern ones, but because every problem requires the right tool for its specific circumstances. Tommy understood this instinctively, drawing on the knowledge his grandfather had passed down, adapting ancient techniques to contemporary challenges. His story reminds us that progress doesn't require abandoning the past. Sometimes the most innovative solution comes from remembering what worked before, from respecting the accumulated wisdom of previous generations, and from recognizing that cultural traditions often encode practical knowledge refined across centuries of experience. In Tommy Whitehorse's hands, a traditional Apache hunting bow became a precision military tool, and the skills taught by his grandfather in the mountains of New Mexico proved decisive on a battlefield in France. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.